'Cause I don't mean it from a religious standpoint, although if that's people's orientation, it certainly fits. But it's that power with where you've got the honor. And to me, honor and respect are such important parts of living as an individual and as in a workplace, of having people that are empowered and there is that grace.
There's one thing you have to accept going in, which is that nobody is 100% right on everything, and nobody is 100% wrong on everything, right? And so if you don't, if you can't have that sort of like underlying element of humility, that the smidgen that you might think you're 100% right about something, but you're going to be wrong on the edges about some aspect of this. There is some opportunity for you to learn and grow through every interaction.
I don't know if it's because I've lived so long, but I mean, I would invite all your listeners to think about, is there something you used to feel so strongly about that you feel the opposite way now? I know in my life, I certainly do. I have really eaten the humble pie a number of times on on positions that I had. And I find now I have my viewpoints and I have what my preferences, but I'm always open because I think curiosity and that willingness to explore and change is something that's really enlivening.
I'm thrilled to be joined today by Karen Valencic, author of the book Spiral Impact: The Power to Get It Done with Grace, in what is now called the Black Belt Edition, something we'll get into today. So welcome to the podcast, Karen.
Hey, I'm delighted to be here, Paul. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Well, first off, really interesting, thought-provoking book. We had the podcast recording scheduled a while back, so I read the book back then, and I got to tell you, some of the themes in it have stuck with me. Let's start with the subtitle, The Power to Get It Done with Grace. You talk quite a bit about conflict in the book. So how do you define conflict, and how do you think individuals and teams mishandle conflict?
Okay. Wonderful question. And how I define conflict, I'm an engineer by background, and I kind of go to basic physics. And conflict, by definition, is to push together. And conflict, that's pushed together. And so that happens when there's differences of personality, ideas, perspectives. And what's important about conflict is you must have it to create. But what happens so often, and when people think about conflict, they often think of destructive conflict. And so when I work with people, I make a huge distinction of the fact that we need to have conflict. And I always have people take their fists together and push and feel that tension. And what makes the difference between that destructive and creative or innovative conflict is how much, how fast, how long, how hard that push is. And depending on the people involved, it can vary. But so often what people think is that we don't want to have any disagreements. We don't want to express contrary opinions. And that's actually the exact opposite of what we need to have. So it's a gift that we have conflict, and it's where all creation comes from. It's where all innovation comes from, is that conflict that we have where there's something that's not like what we want it to be. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does, actually.
Yeah.
So let's actually, just before we leave that,
okay.
It strikes me listening to you that there's really kind of like three areas where conflict can happen. So the first would be internal. So you've got like internal conflict in yourself. The second could be conflict between two people. And then the third can be this sort of broader conflict that's happening within teams. So let's go through each of those individually. Let's start with like this internal conflict. How do you take the fact we all have times where we're conflicted internally and so on? How do you go about addressing that in a way that is helpful?
Well, sure. That's something that I think we all deal with. It's like, well, should I say something? Should I not say something? Should I do this? Should I do that? And that's something we can get really stuck in terms of our momentum forward if we've got that internal conflict. And so when I work with people and myself is, we really got to look at our values. We've got to learn how to ask ourselves questions and really think about what's our overall intent. And those things can help give us clarity in terms of how do we solve this. My work is grounded in the martial art of Aikido. And there's a big part of that, which, now we talk about mindfulness and emotional intelligence. And for the past 3 decades, I've talked about centering, which is a martial arts term for really finding that internal external balance within ourselves. And the beautiful thing about that is it gives us clarity, it gives us calm, and it's kind of like being in the eye of the storm. Typically what happens, there's a very calm eye in the middle of a hurricane or a tornado, and where I want to be is I want to be in that calm eye rather than those outer rings, because that's where I have the ability to enter in with clarity in terms of what do I want to say, who am I, and how do I navigate this turbulence. And so those are all really important parts of it. But internal conflict is, I think, something so many people deal with. And when I talk about when I ask people what prevents them from speaking up when they have a differing opinion, it's often I'm not sure how to say it without creating offense. I'm not
Hmm.
sure. My confidence isn't real high that what I'm about to say is right or whatever that is. So there's all those things, and I often coach people, and for myself, when I'm unsure, I usually enter in centered and with
Hmm.
a question so that I can kind of get a feel for what's the environment. And I think that's such an important thing. So often we want to enter in with stating this is fact, this is where I am. Whereas oftentimes, if you can enter in with a question, open-ended question, you can begin to learn what that environment's like, so you can then really respond appropriately. Make sense?
It does. And I love that. I
Yeah.
love that. What
Uh-huh.
we've seen in our work is that oftentimes people that feel internally conflicted,
Mm-hmm.
they look at other people and they think, "Oh man, those other people really seem to have to get it together," and they seem to think that
Yeah.
like internal conflict is something that just they feel. But in reality, we all feel it. It's just a question as to how we approach the fact that we're internally conflicted, and that centering practice is a huge aspect of it, because it allows you to almost like
Right.
observe the conflict that you're feeling and then take
Yeah.
action based on it, so that you can approach the world in a more focused way.
Right. And I also, I think there's those three components, which is the centering, which gives you that
Hmm.
perspective. There's being willing to enter in with a question rather than with the answer,
Hmm.
and then be really clear in terms of what's the intent. And the intent, I think people can get really confused about. The intention I always define as, when you think about the conflict, what is it that you want that you don't have, that's not dependent on another person because of this conflict? And let me give you an example. I
Mm.
was working with a group recently, and there was a woman who was in the let's see, she was in customer service, and she told me, she said, I really have a problem with our design group, because I I get frustrated because they're not helping me with these customers. And I said, well, what is it that you want? What is the conflict? And she said, well, I want them to know how I feel.
Mm.
And I said, think about that. That's not really the conflict. The conflict is providing great customer service. So when you can start that conversation out with, what I really want is to provide stellar customer service to our customers. And what I really like to have is a conversation of how we can make this handle more smoothly. That is that's a place where you can start to create solutions, and it's not difficult, because
Yeah.
if my deal is you got to know how I feel, that always creates some more resistance, because most people don't know what to do with your feelings. And I think that's a higher level, a deeper
Yeah.
connection. Not to say that it's not important, because it is, but it's not typically, if you've got a conflict, it's, unless you have really, really solid, good relationships, it's not something that promotes more understanding, because that's probably the next conversation or the next conversation. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
that leads us
yeah,
on almost to like that second category conflict that I was
right,
talking about, which is this sort of
yeah,
interpersonal conflict. And
right,
let's deal with a sort of one-to-one interpersonal conflict. Now, sometimes that can be blatantly obvious, right? Two people that are just like hammer and tong against each other. Sometimes it can be
oh yeah,
a one-off conflict, but sometimes it can feel almost like it's intractable. You give a great example in the book of these two guys that work together, and they're always fighting with each other, and then you end up working with each of those individuals together to
yeah,
resolve that, not in a way that just has them pretend that the conflict doesn't exist, or just step
sure.
back, or just stop talking to each other, but something that's more meaningful from that. Can you kind of walk us through that example?
Sure. It's interesting because, and this might bleed a little bit into group conflict because
Yeah.
again, it kind of gets back to the same, which is I have I have worked with so many people, individuals, one on one, and actually teams that are at wits' end, and they will call me up and say, we have tried everything, and we cannot get past this. And of course, I'll say, well, what have you tried? And usually, what people try is they beat the dead horse of the issue. People
Mhm.
get involved in what the issue is, and it's like, you did this, I can't. It's the issue, and I
Yeah,
never start with the
the
issue.
elephant in the room. You talk
Right.
about that.
Right, right, and I
Yeah.
never start with the issue because when you do that, that's typically people's position. It doesn't get back to intent. And so I talk about 3 levels of intent. And there's the bigger picture of what we're trying to accomplish, like what I just mentioned with the woman in customer service. We want to provide great customer service, and that big picture can be even bigger than that. And then there's in the immediate. What's my intention right now? My intention is, hey, I'd really like to have, I'd really like so we can move forward with this. And then really important is that deeper personal intention. What do you carry with you in terms of your values? And just for an example, my deeper personal intention is to honor myself and others as much as I can. And so that's what happens is as I get really clear on what my intent is. And so, I think a lot of times people get so frustrated, and what they want to do is they want to beat up the other person and make them suffer. I mean, we've all
Hmm.
heard those things,
Yeah.
right? And that's something I also like to, we're in a political climate right now, and I don't want to get into politics, but I do want to say, so often people will say, I'm not even going to talk to that person because they will never change.
Yeah.
That statement right there is a beautiful statement from the standpoint, because I always come back and say, but will you? Because when
Hmm.
you enter into the conversation with your intent to change them, see, that's the intention that becomes about
Mm.
them. If your intention is about, I really want to create a great relationship here so we can actually explore the best ideas and create connection to solve problems, that's a whole different intention. And see, so often, and I tell you, I have had some amazing relationships and conversations with people who are diametrically opposed to my viewpoints. But it's always about being interested in how they see things and learning about without judging them and without the intent to change them. And the beautiful thing about that is when you can enter into without the intent to change them, oftentimes they will change
Yeah.
because you're not, again, it gets back to this pushing thing. It's like you get stuck in this conflict and we're pushing each other. And in my work, when I work in person with people, I love it because people can just feel what that feels like to stop pushing and do what I call, which is spiral. And it's palatable that you can feel that. And then it's like, well, how do you do that? And it's not necessarily obvious all the time, and that's why I have a whole book written about it. but
Yeah, of
but it
course.
but
Yeah.
it is it's about intent, because, and something I always say is, you know the three major components of spiral impact are, focused energy or centering. It's about learning, about asking questions, and it's about intention. And those three together, one creates that stable center, one creates the movement around that center for learning, and the other creates a direction. Otherwise,
Yeah.
If you take any one of those out, you have something really wobbly that's probably just going in circles around things.
Yeah.
If people can visualize that, that might be a little too abstract. I don't know.
It might, but we'll get
So,
into the theory of some of that in a little bit. Hopefully we'll help
okay.
people be able
Okay.
to do that. I guess
Okay.
just before we leave this area of conflict, just because it's so interesting and I think so difficult for a
Uh-huh.
lot of people. I mean, there were a couple of things
Mm-hmm.
that you alluded to there, which is interesting. I can almost like feel the people in the audience going, but what if I'm right? Like, what if I must win?
Oh,
Things of that nature. And I think there's a huge aspect to this that's almost like a mindset that needs to come forth initially, which we often talk about with
yeah.
teams, right? Which is there's one thing you have to accept going in, which is that nobody is 100% right on everything and nobody is 100% wrong on everything, right? And so
It's
if you
exactly.
don't, if you can't, if you can't have that sort of like underlying element of humility, that the smidgen that you might think you're 100% right about something, but you're going to be wrong on the edges about some aspect of this. There is some opportunity for you to learn and grow through every interaction. And then the second
Mm-hmm.
aspect, of course, of this is, and this, particularly when you get into group dynamics, is that, and you mentioned this right at the start, right? The idea that people have different opinions in the group, the idea that
Right.
people are, that to a certain extent are pushing against each other, as you pointed out right at the start of this, that is what creates innovation. That is what
Right.
makes the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And in order for us to be able
Yeah.
to really thrive as teams, we need diverse points of view. We need diverse ways of looking at the world. And it's not that we need to eliminate
Yeah.
the conflict, we need to maximize the benefit of the conflict. And so
Right.
when you get into these complex team dynamics, are there specific things that you would do differently when you're working with, say, two people versus when you work with a team? And if so, what would those be?
Sure. And absolutely I do. And, when I work with a team, I often, well, I always start by learning more about them and what their dynamics are. And if it's a pretty high conflict thing, I oftentimes will have a meeting with each person. And if I can't do that, I'll do some kind of really specific survey that I've conducted myself, where I can really kind of understand where their viewpoints are. I love to be able to have those one-on-one conversations so I can create trust,
Mm-hmm.
and that's such an important part. And then when I bring people together, I always like to educate them about what is conflict and how to understand it. And I also am a big proponent of using everything disc. I love
Mm-hmm.
Wiley's everything disc. They have one that's very specific to conflict, that when I first saw it, I thought, oh, they're going to put me out of business, because this is such a great tool. I mean, it really goes into the thoughts people have and all those kinds of things. But I have found that's not going to replace me totally. But really having some self-awareness. But then I get people in a mode, and I'll actually create like it's like a wheel or a map, and I'll have, depending on the size of the group, and I have done this with a couple hundred people, and I've done it with 5. And what I
Mm,
do is I map out the stakeholders of whatever they're dealing with, and whatever their objective is, I put in the center, in the hub. And then I ask them to identify the stakeholders. And then what I do is I take people and I assign them to a stakeholder that is not them. It is not them. And I ask them to think about, from their perspective, what are their needs and what are their fears.
mm,
And so they're getting out of their own part of this, and they're considering the other group from that perspective. And what the beautiful thing about that is, then we come back together and we create this map, and it's such a fantastic way of acknowledging each part of the team or each part of the system or whatever that is. And it's so magical, because again, people aren't pitted against each other, and we're just looking at, okay, so if I were the customer, or if I were management, or if I were the lab tech, What, how would I see this and what would I need? And the conversations that come out of those things for me have always been very productive. And from there, you can just feel the connections happening and the energy building and the enthusiasm building. And I tell you, I love that aspect of my work. I just really love it when people can get the fact that they don't have to struggle, they don't have to beat somebody up to really get some great solutions, and they're not going to lose out on anything. And I've been, I'm not going to say, I had someone over the weekend say, well, yeah, but terrorists won't do this. And, we'll wait for the terrorists, but, if we can't do it in our home, if we can't resolve things in our home or on our team, how are we going to do it on the world stage? So,
Yeah.
but I have seen some amazing things happen. And, I worked with a company that had merged. They had merged several years ago, and I was working with departments between the merged groups, and there was a lot of animosity, tons of animosity. And when I brought them together, there's moments, I don't know if you experience this, Paul, but there's moments when I'm working with a group where there's like this time stands still.
Yeah.
And somebody says something, and it's like, oh, you guys are a lot like us. All these years we've had this opinion of you, but when we can sit and we can talk about, again, what matters, you guys are a lot like us. And that's, I think that's so magical when that happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's one of the realizations that people come to. The other thing that people come to when they get together in these types of team settings is they start to understand what is the unique value that they can bring as a team member to the team, and other
Yes.
people start to see that as well.
Right.
So,
Right.
in a sports setting, so you probably don't know. You might know who Gary Neville is. He talks about other things other than British football these days. But he
Oh.
was in, but he was in the Manchester United football team, and he was in there when like David Beckham was in there, and Cristiano
Okay.
Ronaldo was in there, and all these like star players were in there.
Uh-huh.
And he said something relatively recently, which is like every football team would love to have a Cristiano Ronaldo or a David Beckham, but every football team also needs a Gary Neville, because he was kind of like just a sort of journeyman defender who kind of did things, but like he had to be there in order to create the stability for the team to allow those flair players to do whatever it was that they were doing.
Yeah.
And the magic of that team at that period, which was a very, very high performing team, is that
Yeah.
every team member understood not just the value that Cristiano Ronaldo and David Beckham brought, but they understood the value that a Gary Neville brought, including
Yeah.
him, including he himself. And so
Yeah.
when you can get teams from a point where it's not like everybody is competing to be the star player, but every team member is very comfortable in the role that they are in, and they
Yeah.
value themselves in that role, and the other people
Yeah.
value them in that role. Now, all of a
Yeah.
sudden, everybody's sort of pushing to that sort of broader team goal. And both of those things can happen, what you described and what I just described, and when
Yeah.
you really start to bring teams together and help people understand how they work together to produce this larger goal.
Yeah, it's truly exciting. And I have had situations with teams too where there seemed to be a star player, or may not be in a position that's different than everybody else, but somebody that seems like a really high performer. I've had this happen twice where when we've gone through what we do, a person has kind of started looking at what is important to them and where their strengths are and what brings them to life, and they decide to leave.
Yep.
And a lot of times what's interesting when that person leaves, it raises the whole team. It's like
100%.
the first time that happened, I thought, oh crap. But actually it was just like, it was beautiful, because with that void there, it gave space for other people to rise. And again, that's such exciting stuff. It's just so
Absolutely.
exciting. Yeah.
Teams are complicated,
Yeah.
aren't they? Anyway, so let's
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
we've done, if you like, the subtitle of your book, which is the Power to Get It Done with Grace, and talked about conflict quite a bit. Now let's sort of get onto the title piece of it, the spiral impact itself. Now,
Yeah.
I know that the whole theory about, you kind of almost like had your Archimedes aha moment, right? The whole
Yes.
theory of this came from bringing together two fields that you're expert in, so Aikido and human behaviors in the workplace. So
Mhm.
briefly, if you could kind of explain the origin and what you mean conceptually by spiral impact, and then we'll get into the four quadrants, if you like, after that.
Yeah. Well, so let me start with power with grace. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around the word power.
Mm,
And I think a lot of times people think, well, they have the power, they have it. And what I like to tell people is power is something that you have individually. And you don't have,
mm,
it's not about your size, it's not about your position or your title. It really comes down to how you engage in the world. And I define the difference between power and force. And so often, and I'm just going to, briefly, and this is basic physics, but power is rotational. That's where the
mm-hmm,
spiral comes in. And force is a straight line. Very much the difference between a hammer and a nail and a screw and a screwdriver.
mm-hmm,
A hammer and a nail is force, and you got to keep on hitting it. And that's when people are in big conflict, and they keep trying to hash it out, and they're not getting anywhere because they're using force. And power is rotational, and again, anybody can do that as long as they understand the skill to do that. And so so that's what the model of spiral impact is really about, having power with grace. And I
mm-hmm,
when I wrote the book, I actually was thinking, should I have it power with ease, or is grace?
mm-hmm.
Because I don't mean it from a religious standpoint, although if that's people's orientation, it certainly fits. But it's that power with where you got the honor. And to me, honor and respect are such important parts of living as an individual and as in a workplace, of having people that are empowered, and there is that grace. And then so spiral impact, the spiral became a model. And then I chose the word impact because, and sometimes I wonder if it was the right word in some ways, because the Aikido is the art of peace, or the art of
Yeah.
reconciliation. And so impact can, and as a matter of fact, you see swords in my background, and I've had someone say, how do swords fit in with this peaceful resolution? And so there may seem a little bit of conflict in that visual, but impact is really about getting results. How do I get some results? So, and for me, again, as an engineer and as a person that's hired as a consultant, I want people to get results, because if we just go in and feel good and have a nice conversation, that's a wonderful thing. But I really am all about, how do we get the result, the intention that you want to get in your business? And so that's where spiral impact comes from. And the power with grace is really the methodology. It's like, how do we do this? And if you've seen Aikido, when I practice Aikido, and it's really good Aikido, the person, whoever attacks you or provides the energy, it doesn't hurt them if it's done well. And there's a lot of Aikido that's not done well, I should say that.
Mm,
But it just feels like somebody has just very softly picked you up and laid you down on the ground. And it's really very graceful. It shouldn't be yanking people around or hurting people. And of course, the swords in background, Aikido actually came out of a lot of other martial arts. And the sword is one of those things. And you've got to, when we practice with swords and joes, when you add more length in there, every little movement is amplified. And so creating that sensitivity, so that even when things are amplified, you have that result. That's where that comes from.
mm.
So
And by
yeah.
the way, for
Yeah.
those of us, for those of you that are listening on audio, reminder, we do these on YouTube as well. So you should
Mhm.
definitely check out the YouTube version of this episode, so you can see Karen's very cool background. By the way,
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah, I
um,
actually teach Aikido in this space too,
oh,
which is fun. Yeah.
that is awesome. All right,
Mhm.
so yeah, that's a great example of sort of like the conceptually what the
Mhm.
spiral thing is, but some real things come out of that. So briefly talk us through the four quadrants, and then I
Yeah.
want to get into sort of practical ways in which things like quadrant switching can happen, which I
Okay.
think was one of the most biggest aha moments for me. But before we
Yeah.
get to that, talk about those four quadrants.
Those four quadrants. Okay, so if you can imagine, and actually, the picture of my book has this graphic on the front, and there's four quadrants, and a spiral goes kind of cuts across them. But the four quadrants are, and they're not in a specific order.
Mm.
Actually, and it's hard not to put them in an order. But there's what I call focused energy, which is who who are you? How do you show up? Are you centered and calm? Do you have perspective? Are you whacked out because you're hungover and you've eaten awful things for breakfast? So your energy is how you show up. And the longer I live, I know that's so keenly important. Another of the quadrants is what I call the knowledge quadrant. And the knowledge boils down to turning your statements into questions, acknowledgments, or both. That's kind of a general aspect, but the theme is getting, really beginning to learn about the other person, about yourself, and about the team that you're on. And so those are things that we can do through asking questions, through like a disc assessment, through dialogue with your group. And so those are ways of really increasing your knowledge. Then another quadrant, which is the third one I'm mentioning, although it's not the third, it's just the third.
Yeah.
And that would be intention. And so in the intention quadrant, I look at this, I think I mentioned earlier, and intention is something that I think is most often left out of conflict resolution techniques.
Hmm.
But the intention is, again, bigger picture, longer term. What am I trying to accomplish? There's in the immediate, and I coach people on thinking about, well, what's your intention with the next thing you're going to say? What's the intention of that email that you're going to write? And when people start getting really conscious about thinking through intent before they speak and communicate, it's very powerful. And I have found myself editing myself a lot. And a lot of times I won't say something because the intent's not there in a way I want it to be. And then,
Hmm.
of course, as I mentioned before, that deeper personal. In intention, also, I look at language. What are the words that we're using? And, I've been doing this work for 3 decades, and I always like to say I've changed this work a lot over those 3 decades. And I don't do things that a lot of people do because I find them very hard for people to grasp. Like I
Hmm.
statements, we might get there, but that to me is a more complex. It's not that it doesn't work, it's not easy for people to do. And
Yeah.
so I look at language and my model actually is something that anybody can easily go for and apply immediately. But I look at languages. I also look at, vision and values and that type of thing. And then the final quadrant is support. And that
Hmm.
support is, like, Paul, you're supporting people through doing this podcast, through the work you're doing with Billion Minds. And I do, same thing. Who's your support? How do you support yourself with journaling, with meditation, with what are the tools that you have and the people that you have to support yourself? And so thinking through all four of those quadrants is keen. And actually, I was teaching conflict, what I called using conflict creatively. And I was practicing Aikido one night on the mat, and all of a sudden I was just thinking, I felt like I was missing something in what I was teaching. And I thought, what is it that people what do they want to do in their life? And everybody wants to do what they love and do it with some ease and grace.
Yeah.
That's just what people want to do. And that's what got me thinking, well, what do they need to be able to do that? And that's where those four quadrants fell out, which is they need knowledge, they need focused energy, they need support, and they need intent. And it gets down to basic those four things.
Well,
So
you hinted at something that I actually wanted to jump in on there, actually, which is that I think when folks read the book, and I actually would like if the concepts in here are interesting to you, I would actually go and this would be one where I would actually read it cover to cover, because I think that it's important that you do that to gain kind of like a complete understanding of everything. Um, when I did that, one of the things that I was struck by was the completeness actually of it. Because
Yeah.
initially, when for example, I saw that, I was thinking, well, what about like tools and things? And then all of a sudden, you realize, well, actually, tools are just support, right? Tools
Right.
that which you point out in the book, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
support could be a Google Doc, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
and so once you start to think about it in that way, you start to realize that what you've created here is a sort of like self-sustaining view of any challenge that you might face, which is really impressive. But I will
Yeah.
say, the question that occurred to me out of that is, as you're working with people on a day-to-day basis,
Hmm.
we'll get into the quadrant switching thing in a moment here, but do you find that for certain people, they're just kind of lacking in one of those quadrants systemically, right? As in they kind of nail these other three, but they don't have enough support, or they kind of
Oh,
nail these three of them, but they don't develop not enough knowledge, or maybe they don't focus on being centered enough. Do some people, do they just sort of like have a gap in one area that you can just really focus with them on plugging that gap, and then everything else comes from that?
gosh, that's such a fantastic question. And I would say I have worked with people that have I've worked with people that definitely have the whole focused energy, the lack of emotional intelligence and center that, and
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I don't always start right there, but that's something that, so when people can kind of slow down and come back to themselves, that's a huge, huge, huge thing. The other thing that I find consistently particularly when I go into organizations, is the lack of clear intention.
Mm.
And when I talk about in clear intention, I mean it based as I had described it, which is, what is it that you want that you don't have because of this, that's not dependent on somebody else doing something, or it's I want to, and oftentimes I use the analogy of, if I have this conflict and I want things to be done the blue way and you want it to be done the green way, and we're just committed to our positions on that, that's where we are at loggerheads. But the fact is we've lack intention there. And so and that's where I can direct people to, well, what are you really trying to accomplish that's not about either of those positions? And it all gets back to, gosh, we want to be cutting edge in the area of healthcare. We want to invent the next big thing. So when people can get off their positions on that, because,
Mm.
you had mentioned before that people are right. And, I don't know if it's because I've lived so long, but I mean, I would invite all your listeners to think about, is there something you used to feel so strongly about that you feel the opposite way now? I know
Yeah.
in my life, I certainly do. I have really eaten the humble pie a number of times on on positions that I had, and I find now I have my viewpoints and I have what my preferences, but I'm always open, because I think curiosity and that willingness to explore and change is something that's really enlivening. And I'm hoping, that I continue to set aside things that I hold tightly right now. And that's where, this whole model actually, I feel like, has room for, changing your mind, and to stay with the same idea for your whole career. Like I said, I have taken things out of this course that, are pretty, a lot of other people would say, you got to do that. The way I teach feedback is probably different from a lot of people. I teach
Mm-hmm.
feedback where you start, you're thinking about intent, and you're also not just your own intent, but the person you're giving feedback to. And then you're starting with questions, because, just because you have this viewpoint that they're this or they're that, you don't have any idea what the environment they're living in is. And so, if you don't really understand that, you could just really mess up a relationship, because you've got to rush in with your opinion about their performance. And I don't advise that, because it's a way of disengaging people. in a way that's, I don't think, necessary to get the same result. So, yeah.
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 All right, let's get on to what, in a sense, might be the most impactful piece, at least for me as
Yeah.
a reader of this, which is this concept
Yeah.
of the quadrant shifting that I've alluded to a couple of times already.
Yeah.
So talk me through the concept, and then give me an example of where this has been helpful, let's say in your own life.
Okay. Well, let's see. Um, an example.
Well, let's start with the concept itself.
Okay, let's start. Okay, so the concept is, so we have these four quadrants. We have these four quadrants: the focused energy, the knowledge, the intention, and support. And so the idea of quadrant shifting is, so maybe I want to start out with getting really clear, getting my physical and emotional and my spiritual self really aligned, so I'm really centered and I have perspective. And so I do that, and then I'm thinking, okay, so I'm in a quadrant shift, and and these aren't in any order. I'm in a quadrant shift because now what I want to do is I want to ask some questions so I can really begin to understand. Tell me more about how that works for you. What's your experience with that? Because now I'm becoming curious. I want to learn about that situation. Really, I'm intrigued. Let me know more. And then the intention is, and again, I might quadrant shift to the intention before I go to the questions. Again, it depends on the situation. And I might start out with intention, but I might think, okay, so what is it? And perhaps I'm really, I've got a huge difference here. And my intention is I really want to understand and learn what your viewpoint is, because I respect you, and I really want to make sure that we have covered all the bases on this thing. And so then the support might be, I have a couple colleagues of mine that I consider trusted advisors. And there are people that I can call and I can say,
Mm-hmm.
I just need someone to hear me out loud about this, and just so I can talk out loud. And those two people are really good about asking me questions for clarity. They're really good about not jumping in and problem solving for me. So that's what I really want, is someone that can really help me reflect on that. And that so that that happens, all the time. And so an example, I'm just trying to think of a personal example, and part of it is, as I integrate this so much in my life, it becomes second nature to me to kind of
Yeah.
do these kind of things. So, but I was working a few years ago, and I realized that I was working on this. It was with a lot of high level people, and the man who asked me to do this project was he was huge in this gigantic organization. And I did all this work, and I sent my final report to this group, this small group. And then it was like a couple weeks later, I realized I had left him off the distribution. and I was like, okay, so that's one of those things. The conflict was inside myself,
Yeah.
because I was like, how could have I missed something so vitally important about
Mm-hmm.
this project? And so what I had to do is I had to regroup with myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I came back in, and I said, and the question was, well, my question is how do I handle this? And actually I talked with the person, but what I ended up doing was I called him, and I just said, you know, did you get my final report? I asked him that, even though I know he did not. And
Mm-hmm.
we ended up having a really great conversation, but it allowed me to enter in and ask a question. And it turned out to be no big deal. But
Yeah.
again, that was an internal conflict that I had with myself, because I felt like how could I have dropped the ball so badly on that? But it ended up, it didn't matter, honestly, because we had kind of concluded. I just hadn't sent the final report to him. So, and again, getting back to the intent of, I just want to make sure that you've got this for your documentation and that we're all good to go here. So that, I don't know why that popped in my head at this moment. I just think sometimes for me, it's having that kind of a moment where I realize that I made a mistake, that is my internal conflict. So,
well, I think that's a beautiful way to end it. It's also a great
Yeah.
reminder of the of some of the principles that kind of led to all this, which is mastery is not the same as perfection.
Right.
There's always there's always ways in which we can continue to practice this kind of stuff.
Right.
Thank
The
you
true
so
master,
much.
Yeah.
Thank you
The
so
true
much for
master
joining us
tries and
today.
fails and tries and fails. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so
Really
very much.
appreciate the conversation today, Karen, and I'm sure our audience will as well. Thank you.